A rich father watched as a black waitress let his disabled son try a dance step, and it changed her life forever. The fancy Manhattan restaurant owned by Kingsley became completely silent. People stopped talking. Forks and knives stopped moving. Everyone stared at one small space between the tables. Lucas Montgomery, 10 years old, was shaking. His legs were in metal braces, and they shook as he reached out his hand to Diana Johnson, the only black waitress in the restaurant. The piano was playing a soft song. Without thinking, the boy asked her to dance. "Sir, control your son," Manager Thornton said loudly. "That is not appropriate. This is not a dance hall, and our staff are not here to entertain children." Richard Montgomery, one of the richest men in the country, felt his throat tighten. Since the accident 2 years ago that left Lucas partly paralyzed, this was the first time he had taken his son to dinner in public. He regretted it. "Lucas, sit down," Richard ordered in a low, firm voice. Diana stood still. Her eyes moved between the manager, the billionaire, and the boy's hand still reaching for hers. In her 5 years working there, she had learned to stay invisible, especially around people like Montgomery. "Mr. Thornton, I'm leaving." "My shift is over," she said calmly. She took off her apron and put it on the tray. Then, to everyone's shock, she smiled at Lucas and took his hand. "I can't dance in an apron," she explained. Richard jumped to his feet. "What do you think you're doing?" Diana looked straight at him. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." Before anyone could stop them, Lucas took a shaky step forward. His foot dragged, and the metal braces made a loud screech. But Diana didn't try to fix him or rush him. She slowed her steps to match his. "She'll be fired tomorrow," a woman at a nearby table whispered. Share in the comments where in the world you're watching this story from. If you felt the message, hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story of hope and second chances. Richard froze as he watched. A memory came back, his late wife Elizabeth dancing with Lucas in their living room. She had said, "It's not about perfection. It's about connection." As Diana followed Lucas's clumsy steps, something in his face changed. Fear turned into focus. Shame turned into quiet pride. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't being helped or corrected. He was leading. "Mr. Montgomery," the manager interrupted, "I promise this will never happen again. She will be punished." Richard didn't answer. The whole restaurant waited to see what he would say. Everyone knew a man like him could end someone's career with a single word. Staff stopped working. Customers watched with curiosity. But the only thing Richard noticed was his son's smile. After 3 dance steps, Diana gently led Lucas back to the table. "Thank you for asking me," she said politely, as if speaking to an adult. "It was an honor." She turned to leave, but Richard stopped her. "Wait," he said, his voice sounding strange even to himself. "What's your full name?" "Diana Johnson, sir." Richard nodded slowly. "Diana Johnson," he repeated, as if he wanted to remember it. Richard pulled a card from his jacket and handed it to Diana. "My office, tomorrow at 10:20 a.m. The restaurant went silent again. Diana took the card with no expression on her face, though her hand shook a little. "Dad," Lucas called as she walked away. "Why did you do that?" The question felt heavy, almost like blame. Richard looked at his son. For a moment, he didn't just see the child his late wife Elizabeth had left him to raise. He saw a full person with needs and feelings he had ignored for 2 years. Dinner continued in silence. Nobody noticed Diana's last look before leaving. It wasn't fear or defeat. It was calm strength, very different from the storm growing inside Richard Montgomery. If this story about dignity and change is already touching your heart, remember to subscribe to the channel to see how one small act of respect can start a quiet revolution that changes lives forever. The next morning, the lobby of Montgomery Tower shone with glass and marble in the bright sunlight. Diana, in her best clothes, a navy skirt and a white blouse she had bought on sale, felt out of place. People walking past her wore clothes that probably cost more than her rent for a month. "Diana Johnson to see Mr. Montgomery," she told the receptionist. The woman gave her a cold, judging look before making a call. 18th floor. "Miss Winters will meet you." In the elevator, Diana held her old purse close and took a deep breath. She wasn't afraid. She was steady, knowing she had faced far worse things before. Miss Winters, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and perfect posture, greeted her. "Mr. Montgomery is on a conference call. Please follow me." As Diana walked through the mirrored halls, employees stared. A black woman being led through the executive offices was unusual enough to make people whisper. "He had you fired, didn't he?" Winters asked suddenly once they were alone in a waiting room. "It happens. Powerful clients complain, and people like you lose their jobs." She paused. "People like me. You know what I mean. Employees who don't know their place." Diana smiled softly, not amused. "And where exactly is that place?" Before Winters could reply, her phone rang. "He'll see you now." Richard Montgomery's office covered half the floor. From the giant windows, Manhattan looked small, like his private playground. Richard stood staring out at the city as if it belonged to him. "Mr. Montgomery," Diana said formally. Richard turned, his face calm but guarded. "Miss Johnson, thank you for coming." He pointed to a chair. "Please." The silence after that was not by accident. Diana knew this trick. It was the kind of silence meant to make people nervous, so they would talk too much and trap themselves. "Do you have a background?" Richard finally asked. "Excuse me?" "Education. College." Diana looked at him without fear. "Bachelor's degree in child development from NYU. Master's in special education." "Not finished." Something flickered in Richard's eyes. "Surprise, maybe. And you work as a waitress?" "I work 3 jobs," Diana answered. "The restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, and tutoring when I can find students." Richard picked up a folder from the table. "I looked into you, Miss Johnson. I wanted to know who the person was who—" He paused. "Danced with my son." He opened the folder and showed photos of a community center. "Freedom Steps. You started this 6 years ago." Diana sat straighter. "I co-founded it with my sister, Zoe. It's a dance program for children with physical disabilities." Richard flipped through papers. "And now it's about to close." "No funding." Diana wasn't surprised. She knew he would discover everything in less than a day. "I didn't come here to ask for money, Mr. Montgomery." "Then why did you come?" "Because you invited me." Richard gave a short laugh, cold and empty. "Fair enough." He stood, restless. "I want you to work for me." Diana blinked, shocked. "As a waitress in your house?" Richard's face hardened. "As a therapeutic companion for Lucas." His son's name came out slowly, as if it was hard to say. His eyes drifted to a photo of a smiling woman holding a baby. "I already have the best specialists," Richard continued. "Doctors, therapists, psychologists. But what you did yesterday—" He stopped, struggling with the words. "It was just a dance, Mr. Montgomery." "It was the first time I've seen him smile since the accident," Richard admitted, his voice heavy. "I don't want a dancer for my son. I want someone who can do what you did. Follow, not lead." Diana looked at him closely. Behind the mask of power and control, she saw something else. A desperate father. "I can pay you 5 times what you make now." Diana stood. "No?" Richard looked shocked. He wasn't used to hearing that word. "I don't work for people who see only my skin color or social class before they see my skills," Diana said calmly. "And I don't work for people who think money can fix emotional problems." Richard's face reddened. "You're turning down an offer that could solve your financial problems out of pride?" "Out of dignity," Diana corrected. "And because your son deserves more than someone hired to pretend to care." She walked toward the door, then stopped. "Lucas doesn't need more experts. He needs space to lead his own life." "You don't know my son." "No," Diana agreed. "But I know people like him. People whose physical limits are nothing compared to the invisible cages others build around them." She took out a card and placed it on his desk. "Freedom Steps. Classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 p.m. If you'd like to bring Lucas, the first class is free." As she left, she passed Winters, who had clearly been listening at the door. "You just turned down an offer from Richard Montgomery," she whispered in disbelief. "Are you crazy?" Diana smiled. "Maybe, but I'd rather be crazy than be property." The next Wednesday, Diana was at the reception desk of the community center when Zoe, her sister and co-founder, rushed over. "There's a Bentley outside," she whispered, adjusting her hijab nervously, "and you won't believe who's inside." Through the window, Diana saw the fancy car. Lucas was in the back seat, looking out nervously. Richard stayed in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as if fighting with himself. "He's not coming in," Zoe said. "Men like him don't go to places like this." Diana smiled, remembering Lucas's eyes when they danced. "Don't underestimate the power of a determined son." They watched as the car door opened. Lucas stepped out carefully, adjusting his braces. Then, to everyone's surprise, Richard got out too. He wore casual pants and a sweater, trying to look simple, but his wealth still showed. "I told you he'd come," Diana whispered to herself. Zoe stared at her. "What did you do?" Diana didn't answer. Her eyes shone with a secret. In her small Bronx apartment under her bed, she kept a notebook. It was full of notes about children like Lucas, and about men like Richard Montgomery. Years of observation, research, and planning. And it had all started with saying yes to a boy's invitation to dance. What? Richard didn't know. What he couldn't imagine in his world of money and glass towers was that Diana Johnson wasn't just a waitress. She was a woman with a mission, and his world of isolation and privilege was about to face a powerful truth. The best lessons in life cannot be bought. They must be lived. Freedom Steps ran inside an old community warehouse. Posters covered the walls with phrases like, "Your rhythm, your rules," and "Every move counts." When Richard and Lucas walked in, children with different mobility devices were moving to the music. A girl in a wheelchair spun gracefully. A boy with a prosthetic leg made up his own steps. "Mr. Montgomery," Diana greeted him, wearing a simple shirt with the program logo. "Welcome." Lucas stared, amazed. "It looks chaotic," Richard said, clearly uncomfortable. "There is structure," Diana explained, "just not the kind you recognize." She turned to Lucas. "Would you like to join?" Lucas nodded eagerly, then glanced at his father. "Go on," Richard said tensely. "I'll be right here." Diana led Lucas toward the group. Zoe walked over to Richard and offered him a chair. "The first day is always the hardest," she said softly. "For the parents, not the kids." "This isn't therapy," Richard muttered. "I've already hired the best specialists." "And how has that been working for Lucas?" Zoe asked gently. At that moment, the door opened. An older woman walked in, leaning on a decorated cane. Her gray hair was braided neatly, and her presence filled the room. "Dr. Elaine Mercer," Zoe whispered, "a neuroscientist who studies how the brain can change." Dr. Mercer, retired from Harvard, greeted several children before noticing Richard. "Mr. Montgomery, you've rejected my research proposal 3 times in the last 2 years." "Dr. Mercer." "I didn't expect to see you here," Richard said. "I oversee the research program," she explained. "We study how non-directive movement, letting children move on their own, can rewire the brain in kids with motor challenges." "Research?" Richard frowned. "I thought this was just a community dance class." Diana returned, leaving Lucas playing with another child. "Freedom Steps is a pilot rehabilitation program," she explained. "We use adaptive dance with brain science. The goal is movement autonomy, letting children lead instead of being forced to follow." "Then why do you work as a waitress if you run a research program?" Richard asked. "Because we don't have enough funding. And because people like you rejected us 3 times, it clicked. You were Dr. Mercer's assistant on the proposals." "Co-author," Dr. Mercer corrected firmly. "Diana had to leave her master's program to care for her sister, but her work is groundbreaking." "You knew who I was at the restaurant," Richard said slowly. "From the moment you walked in," Diana admitted. "And when Lucas stood to dance, I saw a chance to show instead of explain." "So the dance was staged?" "Absolutely not. Lucas chose to get up. I chose to follow." Just then, reporters entered the studio. Richard stiffened. "What is this?" "Part 2 of the plan," Diana said calmly. Zoe handed him a newspaper article. "Revolutionary motor rehabilitation methodology shows promising results." "We published today," Dr. Mercer explained, "and we invited the press." "You used my son for publicity," Richard said coldly. Diana led him to a side room where photos of children lined the walls, each with handwritten notes about their progress. One frame was empty. "What's that?" Richard asked. "Our future," Diana said. "A full rehabilitation center. We could reach 500 children a year instead of 50. "You planned all this," Richard muttered. "The dance, the meeting, bringing me here on press day. I saw an opportunity and took it. 4 months ago, when you canceled our meeting without reading the proposal, I promised myself I'd find another way." "Diana," Zoe rushed in. "It's Lucas." They hurried back to the studio. Lucas stood in the center, surrounded by children. The music had stopped. He had taken off one brace and was trying to balance on just one. "Lucas!" Richard started forward, but Diana stopped him. "Wait! Watch!" Lucas took a deep breath, focused, and slowly, shakily, took a full step on his own. Small, unsteady, but fully his. The children cheered. Cameras flashed. Richard's face, usually controlled and unreadable, now glistened with unshed tears. "That's why we created Freedom Steps," Diana said softly. "It's not about perfect steps. It's about first steps. On your own." Richard stared at his son, no longer seeing him as a problem, but as a whole person discovering his own strength. "This could have been done without manipulating me," Richard said at last. "It could have been, if you had answered our calls or read our proposals 3 times, Diana replied. Reporters noticed Richard. A murmur grew as Lucas, unaware of the tension, kept practicing his new step with deep focus. Richard Montgomery was cornered. Before him were 2 choices: walk away in anger, confirming his cold reputation, or embrace the moment his son had created. For the first time, he stood in a place where neither money nor power could decide the next step. The man who once controlled every detail of his life now faced a choice no amount of money could solve. Richard looked at his smiling son, then at the reporters waiting for his answer. Humility was not part of his nature, but seeing the joy on Lucas's face broke something inside him. The life of power and privilege he had always known now played a different tune. Would he keep controlling, or learn to follow? The reporters pressed closer. "Mr. Montgomery, could you comment on your presence at Freedom Steps today? Is it true your foundation rejected funding this program 3 times? Richard glanced at Lucas, who was still practicing his step, unaware of the political tension. Then, to everyone's surprise, even Diana's, he smiled. "You know what's hardest for someone like me?" he asked loudly. "Admitting when we're wrong." The room went silent. Then Richard continued. "The Montgomery Foundation is proud to announce full funding for Freedom Steps for the next 5 years. We will also build a permanent rehabilitation center based on the work of Dr. Mercer and Ms. Johnson." Camera flashes lit up the room. Zoe gasped. Richard raised a hand. "On one condition, Ms. Johnson keeps complete control of the program. No corporate interference." 3 months later, bulldozers cleared the land for the new Freedom Steps Rehabilitation Center. It wasn't the grandest project the Montgomery Foundation had ever funded, but it was the most innovative. Every space was designed with input from the children and their families. Diana often supervised the construction, never alone. Lucas visited often, sometimes bringing other kids. And to the staff's surprise, Richard came too, quietly watching the progress. "I never thought you'd actually come to board meetings," Diana told him one afternoon as they reviewed plans. "I never thought I'd study brain plasticity at 50, Richard replied, rubbing his eyes. In front of him was a research article covered in sticky notes. "But here we are." Diana looked at him carefully. "Is this part of your public image? Or do you really care?" "Lucas asked to have his second brace removed last week," Richard said. "I know. He told me. His old therapist said that wouldn't be possible for at least 2 years. Diana smiled. "But you fired her, remember? Because I told you she was wrong." "And she was," Richard admitted. Diana pointed to a photo of Lucas standing with just one crutch. "He's progressing faster than anyone predicted." Richard paused. "Why did you never accept my apology?" "Because you never gave one," Diana answered calmly. "You moved money, changed policies, and funded our program. That's not an apology. That's compensation. Richard nodded slowly. Fair again. 6 months later, at the center's grand opening, the scene was nothing like that night in the restaurant. The large adaptive space was full of children using all kinds of mobility devices, moving freely with joy. In the middle of the main hall, Lucas, now wearing only a light brace on his left leg, led a small dance with 3 other children. His movements were not perfect, but they flowed with a confidence no doctor had expected. Richard watched from a distance, not stepping in. "He doesn't need you to hold him anymore," Diana said quietly as she came near. "No," Richard agreed, "but he still needs me to be here. That's the difference." He turned to her. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For teaching me how to follow." A reporter came up. "Mr. Montgomery, how does it feel to see your son's progress?" Richard looked at Lucas, who was now helping a younger girl balance. "Proud," he said, "not just of what he's overcome, but of what he's creating for others." "And what's the biggest lesson you've learned?" the reporter asked. Richard Montgomery, once known only for his financial empire, looked into the camera. That real leaders aren't the ones who force others down their chosen path. Real leaders are the ones brave enough to follow when someone shows a better way. A year later, Freedom Steps had expanded to 3 new cities. Diana won a national award for innovation in pediatric rehabilitation, and her methods were being used in hospitals across the country. Lucas, now using only a light cane on difficult days, joined a regular school. He became a youth spokesperson for the program, inspiring other children to move at their own pace. And Richard Montgomery learned the hardest, most valuable lesson. True power doesn't come from controlling every move. It comes from knowing when to step back and let others lead. In a world where the powerful rarely change and the powerless are often ignored, the story of Richard, Diana, and Lucas shows that transformation happens when we cross invisible boundaries. When a billionaire learns from a waitress, and when a father follows in his son's footsteps. Because the greatest revolutions don't start with money or speeches. They begin with a single act of dignity, a first step, and the wisdom of someone else to follow.